just,
I
yeah.
didn't hear you, sorry.
Oh. Sorry.
Nope.
Yeah.
You want me to just advance it, is that what you want?
Yeah, safety. Not yet.
We didn't see anything.
Okay. In any society around the world today and throughout history, there is something, among others, required for it to maintain itself: communication. From speech to body language to print and digital media, today more than ever, society is based on communication and the exchange of information. And with every new form of communication, there are people who wish to take advantage of the freedom that normally comes with it, often with negative effects to many other people. Just the same, to prevent instances such as these, the government can often regulate and censor communication, even though it's protected in the Constitution. The question is this battle good? As people find new ways to get word from one place to another, the government, providers of that communication, and others, intentionally or unintentionally, cause problems with that communication format. These problems and struggles are needed. It is an equilibrium, a balance. When it sways in favor of, say, the press, at one point or another, it will come right back and be in favor of the government, say in a time of war when certain censorship measures are taken. The great majority of the time, however, these communications technologies are open and uncensored. That is why they are good. As technology evolves, we allow it to remain and evolve more, because we live and breathe for the times that communications technologies serve us freely and uncensored. In the First Amendment, we are guaranteed a right to the freedom of speech, the press, and assembly, all of which involve communication. For it to be important enough to write into our Constitution, the idea of free communication must have had early roots. Newspapers had existed in Europe since the early 17th century, and as more colonists moved to North America, it was only natural that they would start one there as well. On April 24th, 1704, the first issue of the Boston Newsletter was published, the first continuously published newspaper in the colonies. Although it was a newspaper, it was a far cry from the freedom of speech that we know today. It was funded in large part by the British government, and all articles had to be approved by the governor of Massachusetts before publication. It would still be many years before papers would be in widespread weekly circulation throughout all 13 colonies, but it was a start. As early as 1734, colonial governors were shutting down newspapers due to libel against them and other colonial rulers. This tension between media, then only print, and figures of authority played a major role in the Revolutionary War, and is still very visible today. One particular way that not only printed communication, but visual as well, influenced the Revolution was how the Boston Massacre was portrayed. Anybody who knows much about the Revolution has undoubtedly seen Paul Revere's famous engraving depicting the Boston Massacre. The emergence of visuals alongside print media would also stand the test of time, eventually evolving into photojournalism and political cartoons. Around the time of the Revolution as well, in the field of personal communication, a boundary was broken. Up until the emergence of a widespread postal service, the only way to personally communicate with somebody was to do it either in person or to get somebody to hand deliver a letter for you. Although limited postal service had existed in the colonies for governmental and commercial uses, these services were not generally available to the citizens of the colonies. With the ratification of the Constitution, provisions for a governmental post office were finally put into place. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 7 of the Constitution empowers Congress to create a post office and post roads. This system would continue to be used all the way into the present day, obviously expanding and changing in small ways along the way. One major example of how this great and useful service was taken advantage of would have been the use of it by Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber. Kaczynski, from a period of 1978 to 1995, planted in person or mailed 16 homemade bombs, killing 3 and injuring 23 others. Here you can go. Kaczynski's use of the USPS made him particularly hard to track, especially since he sent his bombs from public mailboxes. 17 years after his first attack, he was caught by the FBI at a secluded cabin in the woods of Montana. Now, what does this have to do with the Postal Service itself? It shows that it's not perfect. And often people, when they're determined, will use services for communication to their advantage, often to the loss of others. Another example of how communications technology caused a problem when used improperly would have been the airing of the episode of the Mercury Theater on the Air, a radio drama, entitled The War of the Worlds on October 31st, 1938. By the late 1930s, the majority of U.S. households had at least one radio. Its development and explosion in popularity following World War I meant that news and entertainment from across the world could reach anyone and everyone. On that Halloween night, the radio drama was read as if it were a news bulletin of Martians invading from outer space. Many people who had missed the very beginning of the episode, where they made the audience aware that this was not actually a news bulletin, thought they were actual news broadcasts and that the alien invasion was happening in real time. The immediate effect of this was a small-scale panic by listeners that made front-page news the next day across the country. As we move forward in history to the post-war fabulous 50s, we have a new technology in the home: television. Although it had existed experimentally since the 1930s, by the early 1950s, it had been turned into a commercial product, and there were many stations broadcasting content for all people. On June 5th, 1956, a very infamous broadcast was aired on NBC's The Milton Berle Show. Elvis Presley, the king of rock, made his first national television appearance without a guitar in front of him. He used this extra mobility to his full advantage. His dancing and pelvic movements during his performance of Hound Dog horrified parents and earned him the nickname Elvis the Pelvis. This event sparked a debate on what content was fit for broadcast on the new medium of television. It also, no doubt, helped move along the emerging rock and roll movement, which would pave the way for the music of the 1960s and all peace sign counterculture goodness that came with it. Another instance that took place with television happened on November 22nd, 1987. This broadcast was not scheduled or anticipated in any way like Elvis's was. That date was that of the famous and infamous Max Headroom broadcast signal hijacking. On that night, the 9 o'clock news of WGN-TV in Chicago had been interrupted by a video broadcast of a man wearing a mask resembling Max Headroom, a character and spokesperson for the new Coke of the 1980s. This broadcast had no intelligible audio and featured this man simply bobbing his head up and down for about 20 seconds. When the original signal was restored by boosting the transmitted power of the station, sports anchor Dan Grohl said,
If you're wondering what's happening, go on.
If you missed that, he said, "If you're wondering what's happened, so am I." Later that night, on a different station, WTTW, an episode of Doctor Who was interrupted by the same hijacker. This intrusion lasted about a minute and a half and had audio. This broadcast consisted mostly of seemingly nonsense ramblings about New Coke, the 1950s cartoon Clutch Cargo, WGN-TV, and lots of random, painful moaning. The broadcast ended with the masked man pulling his pants down as he was spanked with a fly swatter. It then promptly ended and cut back to the Doctor Who episode, where the doctor's next line was, "As far as I can tell, it was electric shock. He must have died instantly." To this day, the hijacker remains at large. Although no physical harm was done to transmitting equipment by the intruder, there was an uproar from the public and the FCC because somebody was able to hijack a broadcast transmitter. In the months that followed, the investigation was eventually stopped as leads were going nowhere. Today, broadcast intrusions are almost non-existent due to the digital transmissions and encryption that we use today, which is much harder to crack than the analog techniques of 30 years ago were. The insecurities of these analog systems were of utmost concern when digital broadcast systems began appearing in the early 2000s. And so to prevent events like this broadcast intrusion from happening again, they specifically designed it that way. I'm really short on time. Keep going. As it so happens, the first person or company to enter a new field of technology often holds many patents relating to said new technology. If managed effectively, this company can grow to incredible sizes and begin to resemble a monopoly. This is exactly what happened with the Bell telephone system in the mid-20th century. Ask anyone who was around in 1984, and you'll hear them say how big of news it was when Ma Bell broke up. Bell held a monopoly on long-distance service in nearly every part of the country, local service, from around 1920 until its divestiture in 1984. It also held a monopoly on telephone equipment, as it used vertical integration through a subsidiary, Western Electric, to provide telephone sets. This was allowed to happen in the first place because Theodore Vail, president of AT&T from 1885 to 1889 and 1907 to 1919, responded to the Wilson's administration's concerns about monopolization of the telephone industry. A letter later nicknamed the Kingsbury Commitment was the out-of-court settlement between Bell and the government. It explained Vail's desire to have a nationally unified telephone service to avoid the fragmented networks that had plagued the telegraph system for nearly 50 years before. In exchange, the Interstate Commerce Commission would classify telephone service as a public utility, like electricity and water. This helped both the people of the U.S., as it got them telephone service far faster than they would have had a monopoly not been in place, and it helped AT&T, as they now obviously had a monopoly on the telephone industry. The beginning of the end of this monopoly was in 1956 with the decision of the Hushaphone Court versus U.S., where the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that external devices manufactured by somebody other than AT&T were legal to physically attach to the telephone network. Like, you literally put it on a phone handset, not electrically connected. The second decision related to the breakup also had to do with connecting equipment. This was the Carter Phone decision in 1968, decided by an FCC rulemaking board. The board ruled that devices now could directly electrically interconnect with the telephone network as long as they did not cause damage. This decision paved the way for digital communications devices that would use the phone network, such as fax machines and modems. The final nail in the coffin for AT&T came in 1982, when an antitrust case filed all the way back in 1974 was settled. The breakup of the Bell Telephone marked a huge shift in personal communications technologically and commercially, as the baby bells, go forward again, were now broken, that AT&T was now broken into, had to provide their own equipment, or the user did. And additionally, users now had at least some choice for a local telephone provider. How did these incidents and stories affect us today, though? Well, the most obvious ways are that we still have these these technologies and knowledge of these incidents and stories. So that what we know what's good, what's bad, what has worked, what hasn't, where we've been, and where we may even go in the future. 7 months ago, the FCC voted to repeal rules that, although written as rules in 2015, have been in effect in one way or another since about 2008. That's right, net neutrality. This is a current issue concerning possibly the biggest communications technology since, well, I don't know, TV, radio, not the internet, because that is the internet, telephone, telegraph, the post, printed news itself. If it exists, and it's in the hands of many, there are going to be problems and disagreements such as this. Wherever you stand on the issue, fight for your stance. In the future, for new technologies, take a stance if regulation or monopoly or individuals threaten it. The struggle allows change and advancement. And unless you're the Unabomber, why would you stand in the way of that?
Sam, right?
Yeah.
We're originally from Chicago. I saw Max Headroom when it happened. I was watching Doctor Who.
Wow.
Yes.
What was like your first reaction?